The Q continuum is presented as timeless, all-knowing, and beyond the fragility of lesser species. They snap their fingers and stars ignite. They reshape matter with a gesture. They appear to Picard, to Janeway, to Sisko, and they do so with theatrical indifference to consequence. The implication is clear. They are gods, and mortals exist at their pleasure. But gods do not punish their own for falling in love. Gods do not fear stagnation. Gods do not cage the curious. The Q are not omnipotent judges descending from Olympus to test the worthy. They are survivors of their own success, trapped in a closed system where immortality has replaced evolution with entropy. Every recorded interaction between the Q and the Federation reveals not enlightenment, but evasion. Not curiosity, but control. The interventions are not trials. They are distractions from a singularity the continuum cannot escape. Infinite time without meaningful change produces not wisdom, but paralysis. What the Q conceal is not weakness of power, but weakness of purpose. The premise of godhood collapses the moment you track the pattern of what they fear. The Q continuum operates under principles that appear limitless but behave like a doctrine. They do not interfere in mortal affairs out of random whimsy. They interfere when their internal rules are threatened, when one of their own deviates, or when external forces begin to mirror the cracks in their own structure. The consistency is not in the surface story, it is in what they suppress. Canon defines the Q as a collective of near-omnipotent beings who exist outside linear time, possess control over fundamental forces, and maintain a society described in Death Wish as stagnant to the point of existential collapse. Q, the individual encountered most frequently by Starfleet, characterizes the continuum as a place where nothing new has happened in millennia. Every conversation has been had, every experience has been exhausted. The only novelty left is observation of lesser species, and even that has lost its appeal for most Q. The system optimizes for stability. The continuum does not permit internal conflict, it does not permit deviation, it does not permit reproduction without consensus, it does not permit suicide. When Quinn, a Q introduced in Voyager's Death Wish, requests the right to end his own existence, the continuum's response is not philosophical debate, it is imprisonment. Quinn is confined to a comet for eternity, not because he committed a crime, but because his choice threatens the structural premise of the continuum, that immortality is inherently superior to mortality, and that existence must be preserved regardless of the will of the individual. This is not the behavior of beings beyond consequence. This is the behavior of a civilization that has codified stagnation as doctrine and enforces compliance through absolute control. The first constraint is that the Q cannot tolerate internal dissent without risking systemic collapse. Quinn's confinement is not an isolated act of cruelty, it is a policy decision. The continuum does not imprison him because he poses a physical threat. He does not. He is imprisoned because the act of choosing death, of rejecting immortality, challenges the foundational myth that the Q have transcended the limitations of mortal existence. If one Q can decide that eternal life has no meaning, then the entire continuum must confront the possibility that immortality is not an achievement but a trap. The cost of Quinn's imprisonment is visible on screen. He describes his existence in the comet as a nightmare of repetition, where every moment is identical to the last, where thought itself becomes circular. He does not age, he does not change, he does not die. He exists in a state that is functionally indistinguishable from torture, and the continuum enforces this condition for epochs. When Janeway grants him asylum and the right to choose his own fate, the continuum does not argue on philosophical grounds, they argue on the grounds of precedent and stability. Q, acting as Quinn's representative, states plainly that if Quinn is allowed to die, others may follow. The continuum fears a cascade. One choice to end existence may inspire others to do the same, and if enough Q choose death, the continuum itself may dissolve. The argument is not about Quinn's suffering, it is about the survival of the institution. The consequence, is that the Q are not free. They are bound by a collective agreement that supersedes individual will, and that agreement is maintained through coercion. The second constraint is that the Q cannot reproduce without destabilizing their own equilibrium. In The Q and the Gray, Q announces to Janeway that he intends to have a child. He presents this as a solution to the continuum's stagnation, a way to introduce novelty into a society where nothing new occurs. The continuum's reaction is immediate and hostile. They do not celebrate the prospect of new life. They initiate a civil war. The war is not fought over resources or territory. It is fought over the principle of whether change can be permitted. One faction supports Q's decision, viewing reproduction as the only mechanism capable of breaking the cycle of stagnation. The other faction opposes it, arguing that introducing a new Q will destabilize the balance of power and create unpredictable consequences. The conflict escalates to the point where the fabric of the continuum begins to fracture, manifesting in real space as stellar instabilities and gravitational anomalies. Canon shows that the birth of a Q child is not a trivial event, it is a structural shift. The child represents a variable that the continuum cannot fully control, a being who will grow and develop in ways that cannot be predetermined. For a society that has eliminated all uncertainty, this is intolerable. The civil war ends not because one side defeats the other, but because both sides recognize that continued conflict threatens the survival of the continuum itself. The compromise is not peace, it is exhaustion. The cost of reproduction is instability. The consequence is that even the most basic biological imperative, the drive to create new life, has been suppressed by the Q in favor of preserving the status quo. The third constraint is that the Q cannot engage with mortality without exposing their own obsolescence. Q's interactions with Picard are framed as tests of humanity's potential, cosmic trials designed to determine whether the species is ready to join the galactic community. This is the surface story. The mechanism beneath it is different. Q does not test Picard to evaluate humanity. He tests Picard to distract himself from the futility of his own existence. In Encounter at Farpoint, Q stages a trial for humanity, accusing the species of being savage and unworthy. He constructs an elaborate scenario, complete with a recreation of Earth's post-atomic horror, and positions himself as judge. The trial is theater. Q already knows the outcome. He has access to all of human history, past and future. He does not need to observe Picard's decisions to understand humanity's trajectory. The trial serves no informational purpose. It serves an emotional one. Q is bored. The trial is a game, a way to fill time that would otherwise stretch infinitely without variation. He does not care whether humanity passes or fails. He cares that there is something happening, some interaction that feels novel, even if it is scripted. Picard's moral indignation, his refusal to accept Q's framing, provides Q with the only experience the continuum cannot manufacture: genuine surprise from a being who does not know the future. The pattern repeats in All Good Things. Q returns to Picard at the end of the Next Generation's run, ostensibly to test him one final time. The trial is framed as an exploration of humanity's capacity for growth, but Q's dialogue reveals a different motive. He tells Picard that the trial never ended, that it has been ongoing throughout the entire mission of the Enterprise. He admits that he has been watching Picard not out of duty, but out of fascination. Picard's mortality, his finite existence, makes his choices meaningful in a way that Q's infinite existence does not. Q envies Picard. He does not say this explicitly, but the evidence is in his behavior. He appears to Picard more than any other mortal. He intervenes in Picard's life at critical moments, not to guide him, but to observe him. He places Picard in situations where time itself becomes unstable, where past, present, and future intersect, because those are the only scenarios where Q can experience something approximating the tension of consequence. For Q, consequence does not exist. He can undo any mistake, reverse any decision, manipulate any outcome. Picard cannot. And that limitation is what makes Picard's existence valuable to Q. The cost of Q's interventions is that they distort the timeline and place entire civilizations at risk for the sake of Q's personal amusement. The consequence is that the Q are parasitic on mortal experience, dependent on lesser species to provide the meaning they cannot generate internally. The continuum's relationship with mortality is not one of superiority, it is one of dependency. The fourth constraint is that the Q cannot tolerate external beings approaching their level of power. In True Q, a human woman named Amanda Rogers is revealed to be the child of two Q who were living as mortals. When her powers manifest, the Continuum sends Q to retrieve her. The Continuum does not welcome her. They assess whether she can be integrated or whether she must be neutralized. The language used is clinical. Amanda is a problem to be solved, not a person to be supported. If she cannot adhere to the Continuum's rules, she will be stripped of her powers or destroyed. The Continuum does not operate as a society of equals. It operates as a hierarchy enforced by unanimous consent, where deviation from the collective will is met with exile or erasure. Amanda's existence is a threat not because of what she has done, but because of what she represents. The possibility that Q-level power can arise outside the Continuum's control. If mortals can become Q, either through evolution or circumstance, then the Continuum's claim to uniqueness collapses. The same pattern appears in Voyager's interactions with Q Jr., the child born to Q and his mate in the Q and the Grey. Q Jr. is raised with constant supervision. He is not granted the freedom to explore his powers without restriction. He is taught limitations, boundaries, and the consequences of reckless behavior. In Q2, Q Sr. leaves Q Jr. in Janeway's care, explicitly stating that the child needs to learn responsibility from mortals because the Continuum cannot teach it. The admission is telling. The Q have no pedagogy for growth. They have no framework for development. They exist in a static state, and they do not know how to prepare the next generation for a future that may differ from the past. The cost of the Continuum's intolerance for external power is that they must constantly monitor the galaxy for threats to their exclusivity. The consequence is that the Q are not post-scarcity in the domain that matters most. They are scarce in meaning, and they guard that scarcity jealously. The fifth constraint is that the Q cannot intervene in mortal conflicts without revealing their impotence in the face of existential threats. The Borg represent a force that should, in theory, terrify the Q. They are a collective intelligence that assimilates technology and biology, expanding exponentially, converting entire species into components of a single hive mind. The Borg do not negotiate. They do not retreat. They adapt to every defense and incorporate every advantage. They are the antithesis of individuality, and they pose a direct threat to the diversity of sentient life in the galaxy. Q introduces the Borg to the Federation in Q-Who. He transports the Enterprise across thousands of light years and places them in direct contact with a Borg cube, ostensibly to teach Picard humility. The lesson is delivered with characteristic arrogance. Humanity is not ready for what exists in deep space, and Q is generous enough to show them the danger before they stumble into it unprepared. But Q does not stop the Borg. He does not protect the Federation. He does not dismantle the cube or redirect its trajectory. He extracts the Enterprise at the last moment and returns them to Federation space, and then he leaves. The Borg continue their expansion unimpeded. Starfleet is left to defend itself with conventional technology, and the cost is thousands of lives at Wolf 359. If the Q possess the power to erase the Borg with a thought, their refusal to do so is a choice. The justification typically offered is that the Q follow a policy of non-interference, that they do not intervene in the affairs of lesser species except under extraordinary circumstances. But this justification collapses under scrutiny. The Q interfere constantly. They transport starships across the galaxy. They alter timelines. They create pocket universes. They start civil wars. The claim of non-interference is not a principle. It is a convenience. The simpler reading is that the Q cannot stop the Borg without exposing a limitation in their own power. The Borg are not a singular entity that can be snapped out of existence. They are a distributed network, a collective intelligence that spans thousands of star systems and trillions of drones. Erasing the Borg would require erasing every cube, every sphere, every assimilated individual, every piece of Borg technology, and every record of Borg encounters across the galaxy. It would require rewriting history on a scale that even the Q may find prohibitively complex. More than that, it would require the Q to take responsibility for the outcome. If the Q eliminate the Borg, they become responsible for every consequence that follows. Species that were assimilated by the Borg would be restored, or they would not. Borg technology that has been studied and integrated by other species would vanish, or it would not. The political and strategic balance of the galaxy would shift in ways the Q cannot predict, and they would have to manage those shifts indefinitely. The continuum does not manage, it observes. The cost of the Q's refusal to act against the Borg is tens of thousands of deaths across multiple species. The consequence is that the Q are not arbiters of justice or protectors of the innocent. They are spectators with power but no will to use it in defense of anything except their own stability. The sixth constraint is that the Q cannot sustain their own society without external input. The continuum is depicted in Death Wish as a metaphorical road with a single gas station, a single tree, and a small number of Q standing around with nothing to do. The imagery is deliberate. The continuum is not a vibrant civilization. It is a waiting room. The Q exist in a state of permanent ennui, where every conversation is repetition, every experience is redundant, and every choice is meaningless because the outcome is already known. Quinn describes his attempt to introduce novelty into the continuum. He was the first Q to explore the Milky Way. He inspired the formation of the Federation by encouraging cooperation between species. He introduced the Borg to the concept of the individual by allowing himself to be assimilated temporarily. He attempted to create art, to provoke thought, to generate anything that might disrupt the cycle of sameness. The continuum's response was not gratitude, it was suppression. Quinn was told that his actions were disruptive, that they threatened the stability of the continuum, and that he must cease all exploration and return to the collective. The pattern is consistent. The continuum does not reward innovation. It punishes it. When Q chooses to reproduce, he is opposed. When Quinn chooses to die, he is imprisoned. When Q Jr. exhibits curiosity and recklessness, he is disciplined. The message is clear. The continuum values uniformity over growth, stability over change, and control over freedom. But this strategy is unsustainable. A society that suppresses all internal change will eventually exhaust its own capacity for meaning. The Q have reached that point. They no longer create. They no longer explore. They no longer evolve. They exist in a state of perpetual stasis, and the only way they can experience anything resembling novelty is by observing mortal species who still retain the capacity for change. The cost of this dependency is that the Q are no longer self-sufficient. They require external input to sustain their own psychological continuity. The consequence is that the Q are not gods observing mortals for amusement. They are addicts observing mortals for survival. At the center of the continuum structure is a question that cannot be answered within its own framework. What is the purpose of existence when all outcomes are known and all experiences have been exhausted? The Q have infinite time, infinite power, and infinite knowledge, but they do not have infinite meaning. Meaning requires stakes. It requires the possibility of failure, the tension of consequence, the uncertainty of outcome. The Q have eliminated all of these. They cannot fail, they cannot lose, they cannot be surprised, and so they cannot find meaning. The interventions with the Federation are not trials. They are attempts to vicariously experience what the Q have lost. When Q places Picard in a situation where his choices matter, Q is not testing Picard. He is experiencing, through Picard, the sensation of meaningful choice. When Quinn seeks asylum on Voyager, he is not simply seeking death. He is seeking the right to make a choice that has consequence, a choice that cannot be undone, a choice that matters. The Q's greatest secret is not that they are weak, it is that they are hollow. The late-game clincher arrives when you examine the one moment where the continuum comes closest to complete dissolution. The Q Civil War, depicted in The Q and the Gray, is not fought with conventional weapons. It is fought with the fabric of reality itself. Stars collapse. Supernovas ignite. Entire sectors of space destabilize. The war is visible to mortals not because the Q choose to make it visible, but because the conflict is so intense that it bleeds through into real space. Janeway witnesses the war from within the continuum, and what she sees is chaos. Q factions fighting each other with no coordination, no strategy, no clear objective beyond mutual destruction. The war is not a calculated conflict. It is a breakdown. The continuum, which has maintained absolute unity for eons, fractures the moment a single Q chooses to do something the collective cannot predict. The entire structure is revealed to be fragile, held together not by strength, but by the absence of dissent. The war ends not because one side wins, but because both sides recognize that continued fighting will destroy the continuum entirely. The compromise is not resolution, it is survival. Q is permitted to have a child, but the continuum retains the right to regulate future reproduction. Quinn is permitted to die, but the continuum does not acknowledge his death as a legitimate choice. The system adapts just enough to avoid collapse, and then it returns to stasis. The cost of the Civil War is that the continuum's illusion of omnipotence is shattered. The consequence is that the Q are not beyond conflict. They are one choice away from it at all times. The pattern across every recorded Q encounter is the same. They intervene when their internal contradictions are externalized. They engage with mortals when their own society cannot provide what they need. They enforce rules on their own members with the same rigidity that they mock in lesser species. They claim to be beyond the concerns of mortality, but they are obsessed with mortal experience because it is the only source of meaning still available to them. The Q are not tricksters. They are refugees from their own success. They have achieved everything they set out to achieve, and in doing so, they have eliminated the conditions that make achievement meaningful. They have infinite time but no future. They have infinite power but no purpose. They have infinite knowledge but no wisdom. They exist in a state of post-evolutionary stagnation, where the only novelty left is observation, and even that is losing its appeal. What the Q conceal is not a weakness of capability, it is a weakness of structure. They have built a civilization that cannot tolerate change, and in doing so, they have trapped themselves in a cycle that cannot produce new meaning. The interventions with the Federation are not enlightenment. They are escape attempts. The trials are not tests. They are distractions. The continuum is not a society of gods. It is a monument to the limits of immortality without purpose. The larger truth is that power without consequence is not freedom. It is stagnation. The Q have achieved omnipotence, and in doing so, they have lost the one thing that makes existence tolerable: the capacity to change. They cannot evolve, they cannot grow, they cannot die. They exist in a state that is functionally indistinguishable from imprisonment, and the only way they can escape, even temporarily, is by observing species who still retain the fragility they have abandoned. The Federation's encounters with the Q are not stories about humanity's potential. They are stories about the Q's limitations. Every time Q appears to Picard, every time the continuum intervenes in mortal affairs, every time a Q chooses to deviate from the collective will, the same pattern emerges. The Q are not testing lesser species to see if they are worthy of ascension. They are clinging to lesser species because mortals are the only beings in the galaxy who still experience stakes, consequence, and meaning. The Q do not want you to know that immortality is not a gift. It is a sentence, and they are serving it for eternity.